Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're looking at the Cabbage Saga Iceberg. Been really hoping someone would make an iceberg of this, so I actually saw this on the R Cabbage Saga subreddit today, posted by you, Eisengriff. He's a pretty big member of the community. If you haven't heard of him, you really should have. Let's actually just go ahead and just jump right in. I'm really excited to look at this. So on the first layer, we have Poobaloo looking really nice and looking pretty young and fresh. You know, classic old-timey photo of Poobaloo. So first up, we have Marty's Mercs. Marty's Mercs, of course, everyone knows. You got Marty Mutton Chops, Francis Francu, Blubby Dubby, Gene, Way and Daring. You know, those are some classic characters from Aldenard, and they're really kind of the main characters that we see the continent of Aldenard through. Up next we have Lyon. Lyon is a very important city. Hasn't come up in the story in kind of a little while, but its importance to the lore is still definitely there. This is where the Quaggan Council resided for a long time before the battle of basically every army. And that's where a lot of major lore points and major plot points happened at Lyon. Next up, we have the best-selling book series. Obviously, really the only two things that have outsold the Cabbage Saga are the Bible and the Lord of the Rings. That actually leads us into Lord of the Rings ripoff. As you, I'm sure, are aware, everything is ripping off the Lord of the Rings. That's really the only original work. Everything is kind of just derivative of it. But, you know, the writers of the Cabbage Saga acknowledge that, and they know that, and they've actually worked it into the lore, and it's really, really well done. It actually leads into pathos here. Now, the whole series is just full of pathos. Everyone knows about the pathos. It's one of the main reasons it sells so well is because of the pathos. This series is practically oozing with pathos. Next up, we have the breaking of the world. As you are, I'm sure, are aware, since we're still pretty early on in this iceberg, the world of the Cabbage Saga and our world are actually the same world. Most of the events of the Cabbage Saga actually just take place after what is known as the breaking of the world during the Jube-Muslim War. So moving on, we have Jubes. Those are the vile little creatures that pop up in pretty much every single story. They are one of the driving forces of the world, and they are quite horrific and disgusting. Next up, we have Colin. Colin is obviously the son of Tolkien and one of the major influences in the world of the Cabbage Saga. Pretty much any ancient weapon you come across is going to be made by Allah himself, and there are many servants of Allah like Rand al'Thor Dragon. Next we have Islam is true. In the world of the Cabbage Saga, Islam is actually a true religion. Allah exists, although he is not the one true God. That is one thing that they did not get right. But pretty much everything else in like the Quran and all that is correct. Lastly, on this level, we have Eisengriff and Lindenrow. This is really the duo that started it all. Everyone knows who they are. You can go down the street, ask anybody, hey, have you ever heard of Eisengriff and Lindenrow? And they look at you like weirdly as if, of course I know who they are. Who doesn't know who Eisengriff and Lindenrow are? And that's it for the first layer. Let's go ahead and move on to the next layer. Alright, the next layer, we have Poobaloo looking quite dark and getting a little bit more risque, I guess you could say. So let's go ahead and start off here with the Tales of Shinto Abe. Obviously, Shinto Abe is a very influential character in the series. This is his premiere series. It follows his life and his adventures. Lots of really good moments from that one. I would highly recommend reading that if you have not. Got some of my favorite characters like Monkey in it. Monkey he was the best of us, really. Moving on, we have Primordial Oozes. Primordial Oozes are an important part of the lore. The two main Primordial Oozes we know about are, of course, Eisengriff and Lindenrow, and their companion Twiggle, who doesn't make a lot of appearance but is also an ooze. Now, what Twiggle's up to, we don't really know, and that's one of the greatest mysteries in the lore. It's one of those really fun things to kind of dive into. We have Cantha wins here. So Cantha, as you I'm sure are aware, is a very powerful nation state and faction in the Cabbage Saga world. During the later parts of the more fantasy sections, they actually kill the sun, kicking off the events of Cabbage Saga sci-fi and creating a galactic empire. Cantha is kind of one of those factions that's just so powerful that they will pretty much win anything that they're involved in. One of the more recent examples in the text is, of course, the Ooze Awakens with their invasion of Tyria, that was really only stopped because of Isengriff and Lindenrome. Next up, we have Poobadoo. Poobadoo is, of course, the original antagonist of the series. He was in the first Lord of the Quaggins trilogy as the main antagonist. Kind of a big influence on the series as a whole. And of course, they did also write the Chronicles of Poobadoo, really detailing his rise to power. Up next, we have Tom Bombadil's Evil. Now, Tom Bombadil is Tolkien's first son. Tom Bombadil was upset because Tolkien did not allow him to really create anything he wanted. So Tom Bombadil created the Bombadilians and kind of corrupted everything, and is one of the main evil forces in the entire series. His influence is really felt all over. So next we have the Prophecy of Slayer. Slayer is, of course, the main character of Slayer's Awakening. Now that's a bit of a more uncomfortable read. It asks a lot of hard questions. You kind of have to look within yourself and realize that, hey, maybe this world isn't as great as we think it is. Slayer is two beings in one kind of. Slayer is a very strange being. But there's actually a prophecy about Slayer and how Slayer will bring about the end of the world. And of course, that is what Slayer 1 and Slayer 2 are trying to bring about during the events of Slayer's Awakening. Up next, we have God Emperor Donald Trump. God Emperor Donald Trump, of course, during the sci-fi era of Cabbage Saga, was one of the galactic rulers and a major player in galactic politics. Now, not a whole lot is known about God Emperor Donald Trump. He's kind of a bit of a mystery figure in the lore. All we really know for sure is that he is extremely powerful, and he kind of has the final say on any policy in his empire. We have Tolkien up next. Now, Tolkien is, of course, the one true god of the Cabbage Saga. He wrote the Lord of the Rings, and in doing so, created the world. Once again, Lord of the Rings ripoff. Everything's a ripoff. And when I say everything, I really mean it. I mean, your life is a ripoff of the Lord of the Rings, and it's all due to Tolkien. Middle-earth being real, that all ties back into Tolkien writing Lord of the Rings. Of course, Middle-earth is real. That's where our world comes from in this lore, and everything that happens in Middle-earth really did happen. Now, Cube is a classic villain from Legend of Mount Dimlock. Daeth Gudo and Jubi-Dubi end up fighting and defeating the Cube. And he is kind of a mystery figure in the lore as well. We don't know a whole lot about Cube. All we know is that he is very powerful. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to the next level here. Alright, we're at Layer 3. We have a Jube Ham, Jube Kaida. Love this image, it's one of my favorites. And we're going to start off with Marty is gay. Marty Muttonchops of Marty's Mercs is actually homosexual. Now, this is something that's subtly referenced in the text, but it is very obvious when you're looking for the signs. And he actually, in the fairy kingdom, in the Undernard, is confronted with this and he rejects it. Now, I personally think that it'd be good for him to really embrace it and kind of move on. It seems like Gary Goatee might have a bit of a crush on him, but we're not entirely sure on that front. And I think they'd actually make a pretty good couple if they were to get together. Let's go ahead and move on, though, to Aktasha. Aktasha is, of course, an extra-dimensional space. Kind of connects a lot of different areas of the galaxy together, and you know, it's kind of another mystery point in the lore. We don't know a whole lot about it. I'm sure in the next Elder Scrolls Online story that we get, they will expand on that, particularly in the Wormy plot line that they're planning. We're not entirely sure what that's going to be like, but it will likely have something to do with Aktasha. Aktasha is very important for faster than light travel during the sci-fi era, and you know, it's something that we'll definitely hear a lot more about when we get to Wormy. Let's go on to Muslim Mars colonies. During the Jube-Muslim War, and actually a little bit after the Jube-Muslim War, the Muslim community was actually sending out spaceships to Mars to colonize in the wake of all of that destruction. We actually go to one of the Mars colonies in Fate of the Frogs. Marty and Francis end up there, and they actually make contact, and we learn quite a bit about what has happened to them during those thousands of years between the Jube-Muslim War and the events of Fate of the Frogs. Moving on, we have Purgatory. Pretty much anyone who dies in the Cabbage Saga ends up in Purgatory. Purgatory is a really, really large area. It kind of exists outside of space and time and is run by Spookmaster. The amount of cultures and people and lands that are in Purgatory are kind of unknown to us. It's such a large area that we really only scratched the surface in the stories. Up next we have the Undernard. The Undernard is, of course, the area where Journey to the Center of Aldenard takes place. Marty and Francis end up there after the events of Kingdom of the Crystal Cube. Spydron acts almost kind of like a fake sun, keeping things alive down there. They meet Thickman. There's a whole bunch of civilizations. It's kind of like another entire world underneath the ground of the Aldenard. But unfortunately, it is destroyed completely during the events of Journey to the Center of Aldenard. So whether we'll go back to the Undernard, I really can't say for sure, but there's quite a lot of lore there to kind of dig deeper into at some point. The Glorious Frog Empire. Now, this is actually during Fate of the Frogs. We have the Glorious Frog Empire front and center, obviously run by Frogs Pierre, and kind of run a bit from the shadows by Greg. Their downfall takes place during that story, and they're kind of relegated back to living underground like they originally did. Alright, Amir killed Stephen Hawking too. During the events of Prince of Flames, Amir actually ends up killing what is believed in the community to be Stephen Hawking too. It's kind of a tragic tale. I would definitely recommend giving Prince of Flames a read if you're interested in anything like that. Now we have the world-spanning underground hippie drug ring. Now, in a lot of stories, the hippies actually make an appearance, and there's usually an arc or a plot surrounding them. Now, this is actually the same group of hippies in every single story. They have an underground network of tunnels leading to all major civilizations where they can operate and sell their drugs. Next up, we have Clown Ninjas. During Straight Outta Holbrack, there's the Clown College introduction. Now, there's a lot of different types of clowns, like just your basic party clowns, balloon clowns, mimes, but then you also have the Clown Ninjas. Now, the Clown Ninjas are an elite group of clowns that are very stealthy and very deadly. So if you come across a Clown Ninja, I would definitely recommend trying to get away. Although, honestly, if you run into one of them and they're mad at you, you're probably not going to make it out anyway. And lastly, on this section, we have the Void. The Void is the space between universes. Yes, the Cabbage Saga is a multi-universe story, a multiverse, if you will. And the Void is an area that kind of exists between these different universes. A lot of people are able to see the Void, but not many are able to go in. There is a vessel that can actually traverse the Void, and we'll actually touch on that a little bit later here. Let's go ahead and move on to the next level. Alright, we're on to the next layer here. Looks like we have Death Gudo right here and Juby Dooby looking pretty upset about something. This is definitely a sign that things are getting a little bit deeper. So, first of all, we have the Burger Kingdom. Now, Burger Kingdom is a region within Purgatory, run by what sounds like Burger King, you know, the fast food chain. And that is confirmed. It's a pretty fucked up place. They've got a lot of dead giants, essentially, that they've carved up to make their burger meat, their Whopper meat. It's actually, the giants were called the Whoppers, and it's kind of debated within the community if they named them the Whoppers or if they named the Whopper after the giants. Moving on, we have the Fallow High Genocide. Sounds like during the events of the Fellowship of Cabbage is when the Fallow High Genocide truly began. We see the beginnings of it with Romalda and Halbo. Now, we have yet to see the full resolution of the Fallow High Genocide, but we do know how it starts, and we know that it's mainly perpetrated by Mayor Will Whitfoot, or rather Supreme Overlord Will Whitfoot, and Assistant Fallowhide themselves, which of course Assistant Fallowhide is a Bombadilian, leading back up here to Tom Bombadil being evil. He's kind of the main driving force of that series if you really stop and think about it. You think it would be Sauron, because you know that's kind of Isengriff and Lindenro's whole plot, but it's really all about Tom Bombadil. Now, back down here, the moon is sentient. There have been many instances within the series that kind of hint towards the moon being a sentient being. And that's really all I have to say on that one. Next up, we have Allah killed the dinosaurs. During the events of Cabbage Hunters, Lindenrow actually fought the evolution beast. After seeing the immense pain and suffering that beast was causing itself due to its nature of constantly changing and evolving, Allah really kind of decided that it was probably not a good idea to continue to let dinosaurs evolve, so he decided to kind of nuke everything and just kind of hit a reset button on the ecosystem of the Earth. Various Jupe forms. Now, throughout the series, we've actually seen plenty of Jupes, but we've also seen different Jupe types, such as Jupe blobs or boob Jupes, to name two of the more well-known types. So Jupes come in many different forms, and some are more powerful than others. Up next, we have the Blood Lakes. Now, in Purgatory, there's actually a couple of different Blood Lakes. The first one we see is actually in Colin's Inferno, when Isengriff and Lindenrow come across one. But a more recent example is when we actually came across a Blood Lake in Journey to Valhalla. Shinto Abe and the Gimp met Mog the Frog, who is actually creating his own Blood Lake. Up next, we have Obama's Taint. A lot of people are familiar with the Norn disease. Now, that's actually just part of Obama's Taint. You see, a long time before Straight Outta Holbrook, during the events of the story about Obama specifically, Obama actually curses the Norn with the Norn disease and the dwarves with turning them to stone. It's known as Obama's Counterstroke or Obama's Taint. Up next, Greg did nothing wrong. So a lot of people are upset with Greg, with good reason, I'd say, for the most part. He's not the nicest person. However, if you really think about it, the whole world has kind of been kicking Greg while he's down since his conception. Being the son of Juby Dooby doesn't really lend itself to being mentally stable or having a good childhood at all. And he kind of just grew to resent the world, and, you know, he eventually became a hate revenant. But, you know, when you really think about it, Greg probably wouldn't have done any of that if it wasn't pretty much the entire world against him at any given moment. Up next, we have 27 Pecan Joe's Eternal Torment. So during the end of Clash of the Clans, Pecan Joe is consumed by a slub and shit out. Now, his consciousness is actually still within that piece of shit. and that piece of shit is floating through the cosmos and the void for all eternity, effectively making Pecan Joe one of the most tormented souls in the entire series. Lastly, we have Ronald Dragon Apocalypse Cult. So Ronald Dragon obviously was a main character during Saving Private Bunyan. He and Rickard Mix found the sewer people within the mists on their search for the ancient evil. When they found them, Ronald Dragon was already beginning to go mad with power and revenge. After convincing the sewer people to join his cause, they started an apocalypse cult, which their main goal, of course, is to bring about an apocalypse and the end of the world. Now, with that being said, obviously Ronald Dragon actually gets killed by Rickard Mix at the end of the story, and Rickard Mix gets executed for treason. Now, with all of that, after all of that has happened, the cult survived. They eventually spread all across the planet of Tyria, and they're waiting in the shadows for the return of Ronald Dragon himself to bring about what they are calling the Dragon Tide. Alright, let's move on to the next level. Alright, we have Lindenrow on this next level. He is kind of side-eyeing the camera, showing that things are really starting to get a little bit dicey down here. So first up, we have the Ancient Portuguese Dragon Conspiracy. Now, this is not as well-known lore in the general circles. You're seeing that these are starting to become more obscure as we're going down. Now, the ancient Portuguese dragon conspiracy is a conspiracy that the dragon family, yes, and I am talking about the same dragon as Ronald Dragon. The dragon family actually are the monarchs, the kings and queens of Portugal. Now, this all started during the events of the true history of the conquest of Brazil, when Brazil was an international superpower in the 13 and 1400s. After the events of that story, the dragons become the regents of Portugal and are home to ancient knowledge of Brazil. Now, we don't know exactly where this is leading, but I'm sure that the authors have something really cool planned for the future. Up next, we have the Last Egg of Babylon. During the events of Prince of Flames, we have Amir Asa and Omar finding the Last Egg of Babylon. And you might be asking, what is the Last Egg of Babylon? Well, there's a race called the Babylonians maybe. And they meet the keeper of the egg named Gorg. Now, Gorg actually ends up making them leave due to means of temporary insanity. During this, though, they actually end up breaking the egg, dooming that entire race to extinction. Up next, we have the half-Jube Japanese Emperor. During the events of the last Weeb, the last Emperor of Japan actually spliced his DNA with Jube DNA in order to bring about a hopeful subjugation of the Jubes and to create an army of his own using their power. Now, Matt Valenroth and Kyle actually managed to stop him near the end of their adventure. Up next, we have the Void Ark. Now, I kind of hinted towards this when we were talking about the Void way back up here on level 3, but the Void Ark is actually the vessel in which that allows people to travel across the Void into the other universes. We haven't quite seen the Void Ark in action yet, but I'm sure we will get there in an upcoming story, probably in the Aldenard region. That seems to be where it's currently located. Up next, we have the Grey Goo Mammoths. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the Ummuths, but what they don't realize is that they are only really able to gain sustenance by eating each other through cannibalism. Now, if you are consumed by an Ummuth and you're not an Ummuth, you're actually reduced to this gray goo. It's an extremely painful, terrible way to die. Up next, we have the Orc Cloud Gibbons defending the solar system. Now, This is actually a major plot point in Fate of the Frogs when Marty and Francis actually encounter the Gibbons in the Oort Cloud. They are the protectors of the solar system, and unfortunately, they are wiped out when the Canthons blow up the sun. This is probably one of the most pathos-filled sections in the entire story. Next, we have dinosaurs in space. During the events of Valenroth Hunters, Lindenrow actually shoots a termagant into space. Now, assumed dead, they don't worry about it, but actually what happens is that termagant evolves into the dinosaurs seen in Halo Dinosaurs Evolved. They are the same species, just very, very far apart in terms of time. Next, we have the Song of Unmaking. Now, the Song of Unmaking is a lesser known ability within the universe. It's used primarily to unmake extremely powerful beings like the angels of Colin and Allah. It's theorized that the rap orchestra will actually end up utilizing the Song of Unmaking to take care of Obama at the end of Straight Outta Holbrack. It's also implied that Rand al'Thor Dragon actually used the Song of Unmaking himself to take out other angels. Now, lastly, we have the Gulf War is canon. Now, we have in the events of the last Weeb, one of the main characters is Kyle. Now, Kyle's actually the American sniper and was actually fought in the Gulf War. So the Gulf War in our real life actually happened in the Cabbage Saga as well. So let's go ahead and move on to the next level. Alright, and for the next layer we have Francis Francu here looking pretty upset. This is from the kind of tail end of Journey to the Center of Aldenard, where things are starting to get really dark down in these parts here. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So up first we have Muhammad killed Jesus. Now, this hasn't been 100% confirmed yet, but it's heavily implied that during the events of the fall of the old gods, which is an upcoming story, that Muhammad will in fact kill Jesus. Up next, we have the fetus pool. When fetuses die, they are actually sent to purgatory and they end up in a massive pool known as the fetus pool. So every single dead fetus ends up in this one spot in purgatory. And this actually will come back in a little bit here when we talk about the events of Unborn and the lore behind that. Next up, we have the monk life and the thug life. So these are essentially two halves of the same coin. Death Gudo is the current thug life, and he embodies everything about the thugs. But there's also another side to this, which is the monk life, which is essentially the polar opposite of, they're good guys. They're not really trying to hurt people, whereas the thugs are obviously going to be really chaotic and violent. Up next, we have Yoda is a Jube. A lot of people misinterpret Yoda into being a frog or his own thing, but he actually is a Jube, and he is just so fucked up on Botox. It's kind of funny, but he is a Jube. It's not very well known, but he is in fact a Jube. Next, we have Jesus discovered America. So it's actually implied during the true history of the conquest of Brazil that Jesus himself actually discovered America and left both the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail there, explaining the appearance of the Knights Templar and the whole quest of trying to find the Ark of the Covenant there. Next up, we have the tormented Santa Oversoul. Now, Santa is a figure that has appeared in many different stories over the years, but it's actually the same being. Santa is constantly spun out into the world, and every time he comes out, he is actually usually betrayed or murdered, or something horrible happens to him, and his entire existence is really quite miserable. When he goes back to purgatory after his demise, he ends up in his own mindscape there, and we actually see that mindscape in the events of Soul of Souls and the events of Journey to Valhalla. Now, lastly on this layer, we have the Tolkien map mind control. This is one of the more obscure lores out there. You see, when Tolkien made Middle-earth, he actually made the map on parchment, and he subtly made it so that if you're making any sort of fantasy map, or really any map in general, you have an urge to make it on a piece of parchment so it matches that aesthetic that Tolkien set all that time ago at the genesis of creation. So let's go ahead and move on to the next layer here. Alright, next we have the plastic surgery Jube level. Now these things are getting really dark here. So on the plastic surgery Jube level, we're starting off with something heavy. Koss murdered his pregnant wife. So Koss, the best friend of Isengriff and Lindenrow during the events of Chronicles of Pumbedoo, actually ends up killing his pregnant wife, sending what we now know as the Orphan of Koss into purgatory. Now, the Orphan of Koss is the main orchestrator of the invasion of London by the fetuses, which we'll actually talk about now, since it's a perfect segue. Now, London actually is destroyed by time-traveling fetuses. They utilized the nature of purgatory, of it being a place outside of time and space, to invade Victorian-era England, which Spookmaster then sends Isengriff and Lindenrow to take care of during the events of Unborn. We have the Infinity Jube. Now, the Infinity Jube has been mentioned in two major sections of the story. The first appearance, or mention rather, and it was an appearance as well, is during the events of Prince of Flame, when Amir is on his hippie drug trip. He actually sees the Infinity Jube and is almost driven mad. The second appearance is during the Fate of the Frogs, when Marty and Frank fight the Harbinger of the Infinity Jube. The Gibbons, unfortunately, are there to help them, and they're able to drive it off, but it essentially confirms that someday the Infinity Jube will wreak havoc on the universe. Next up, we have Jube Ass. This one is pretty dark. I'll go ahead and throw an image up here, but I will censor that for you guys, because honestly, you don't really want to see it. Jubes do have an ass. Someone modeled that, and honestly, I don't know why, but it is a thing. So next we have the music contest. So the music contest is effectively the genesis of the entire series. Isengriff and Lindenrow got into a music contest. I'm not going to speak to one side or the other. It's a heavily debated topic within the community, but all you need to know is that some people think Isengriff won, others think that Lindenrow won, and it's really kind of the genesis of the entire series. And I think, if my predictions are correct, that they are going to be actually diving into the lore of the music contest more during the Lord of the Rings series currently being published. Lastly, on this level, we have Steve Harvey joined the Taliban. And yes, I do mean Steve Harvey from Family Feud and as a TV personality. Now, during the events of the Jew and Muslim War, obviously, the timelines are going to differ. So instead of being on Family Feud, he actually ends up joining the Taliban in defense of Kabul. And he actually is a major player in that story, and it's not really well known, but it is the same Steve Harvey from TV. Alright, and let's go into the last section here. So looks like we have Lindenrow dancing. Lindenrow banged a cat.